for taking your time. You all are the people that make a difference in your communities by serving, and it is a thankless job. Believe me, we know it. My name is Bill Campbell. I'm with Campbell Property Management. We are sponsoring this board certification course for homeowners associations today. We're going to specialize in homeowners associations. Campbell Property Management has been serving this area since 1953. So we're very proud of that. We have around 400 communities, 6 offices, some local you may recognize. Of course, we do Parkland Golf and Country Club where you are here. We do Cypress Head. We do Watercrest, Regency Lakes, Meisner Country Club, Jupiter Country Club. For Plantation and Jupiter, those are just a few. But thank you for coming out this morning. We really, really appreciate it. We have a good morning. Hopefully, some of the material is a little bit boring, but some of it's good. You'll really enjoy it. We'll make it interesting as well. One thing I want to point out, we have a newsletter called the Florida Association News, FAN. I would strongly suggest you sign up for it. You will not get any advertising, any spam. It is very specific to what we do. Homeowners associations and things that are going on in our industry. There's also a great search engine that will limit, called Fan Search, that will limit your search, again, to homeowners associations and condominium information. So you don't get the 9 million things that Google will provide if you're looking for something specific about homeowner associations or condos. So if you need any help or have questions about that, ask Ashley, Dan, or myself. One thing I want to point out here this morning, if you can, please, we will be around. We'll be around during the breaks if you have questions. If you have a question, we'd ask you, if possible, to hold it till the end. If you have a generic question, sometimes it's okay if it's relevant, but please, because we never get through this, we've done it enough times, we don't get through it if everybody asks a specific question about their community. So just be courteous. We'll be around. We're happy to answer them. We just want to keep this moving. So just appreciate that. We do about 12 of these a year, by the way, in different areas, again, between Plantation and Jupiter. So we try and go to the local communities. As some of you know, with a company this size, we want to be involved in the local community, thus make it convenient to you all here by doing it in Parkland. But we're very involved in the community. That's something we take a lot of pride in. So this morning we have Dan. Dan Tiernan is one of my partners here. Dan is the COO, and Dan Wasserstein is also here. Dan is the lead attorney. So this is the Dan and Dan show today. You get Dan Tiernan and then Dan Wasserstein. Dan Tiernan's going to talk a little bit about board member practices, and one of my favorite topics, how to run a great board meeting in an hour. So I enjoy it every single time. I've heard that 18 times. So with that, Dan, you want to come up, please? And thank you all for coming.
What the attorney's going to talk to you about today is what's legal, what you can and can't do. What I want to talk to you about is how to be more efficient and more effective, kind of outside of make sure it's legal at the same time. And the area we would like to focus on is board meetings. And the reason why is that this is really the most visible thing you do in your community. And if you appear dysfunctional in a board meeting, your unit owners are going to assume that you're dysfunctional. So we want to make sure that we give you some tips here to have as an effective board meeting as possible. Now, before we get started, I'm just curious about people's experience. So let me see raise your hand if you've got between 1 and 5 years experience on the board. All right, that's probably 40%. How about between 6 and 10? Got a few. How about people with over 10 years experience? Okay, anybody with over 15? We're still going. How many, can I see him again? 15? 1, 2, 3, 4. Diego, how many do you have?
4.
4, perfect. So Diego's got gavels for those 4 people. So can you please raise your hand? Because you guys have been doing this for a long time. We appreciate it. And
The reason I'm giving you the gavel is if I say something wrong, or if you want to add something at any point, you've earned the right to bang it on the table and say something and interject, okay? So, I guess before we get going, one of the first things we ought to define is what makes for a good board meeting. And I always find the easiest way to do that is to talk about the opposite first. What makes for a bad board meeting? So do I have any ideas, suggestions of what makes a bad board meeting? What? Not organized? Anything else? What? Starts late. Poor attendance. Too long. There we go. That was the one I was over. So in the bottom, what I tend to nail it down to here is three things. It takes too long, nothing gets done, and everybody leaves disappointed. So what we want to try to do is talk to you about how to do the opposite of that. How to make sure it gets done in a reasonable amount of time. You get everything accomplished that you intended to get accomplished, and everybody leaves happy. That might be a little wishful thinking, but let's shoot for that. So I'll do another little poll here. This is also just to get your blood flowing and exercise in the morning, in case you didn't exercise yet. So I just want to see a raise of hands. How many people would say that your normal board meeting lasts, normal one without a special assessment or anything unusual, rule change, would last an hour or less on average? You guys are awesome. You can leave. No, you guys can chime in. Because that's great. That's probably the best response I've seen before. How many would you say, raise your hand if your typical board meeting lasts between an hour and 2 hours? Got a few hands there. Okay, how about anybody having it that is typical board meeting over 2 hours? Okay, that's unfortunate. Unfortunately, I saw like some of the people are our clients. We have to work with them too. So, but sometimes it's just, if you've got 15 people on your board, or if you've got, a lot of things going on, it sometimes can be difficult to do it. So what we're going to do here is talk through 9 steps to an effective board meeting. And I would love to tell you that I'm smart enough to figure this out all by myself, but the reality is I cheated. What I did was, Campbell has 130, I think that's 136 now, licensed CAMs. And we get them together 4 times a year. And we sit down and talk through different discussion items, and we have little roundtable meetings like this. And I sat them down a few years ago and had them each. I asked them all, what makes for an effective board meeting? And I had 100 of them sitting there in groups, and they came up with their thoughts, and then they all stood up and presented, and we videotaped it and wrote it all down. So that's where I got this from. So this is like 1,000 years experience from our collective group of managers, what they thought were 9 effective steps to a board meeting. And also, Bill mentioned earlier this Florida Association News. There's a blog post on there called 9 Steps to an Effective Board Meeting. So that's kind of the short summary of this as well. And just an example of something you can find on there. So that's what we're going to go through today. So we already talked about Florida Association News. Yeah, you can find it at readfan.org. And so the first step, obviously, is being prepared, making sure, and this is really making sure that the only things you have on the agenda are items you're really ready to act on. I mean, a lot of new board members will talk about wanting to make sure they're transparent and sharing everything, which is a great and noble goal, but that doesn't mean show up and start brainstorming and kicking around ideas about things at a board meeting. If you think that something might take 10 or 15 minutes discussion and you don't have a clear plan of action on what you ought to do, you probably aren't ready to have the board meeting yet. You probably have that on the agenda yet. You'd be better off kind of having private conversations and doing some more research, offline before you do that. And I'd say one other key thing is making sure that you've got a good board package well in advance. So if you're meeting, really at least 3 days before, you should have everything you need so that you're able to read it and prepared, and you're not shuffling through papers as you're going through the board meeting trying to look at bids. So I think that's the most important thing, really, is just making sure you're prepared is the first step. The second step is making sure that you've got the right setup and equipment. One of the real simple things that I think a lot of people, most boards, when you go into a board meeting, you see the table is just lined up in a straight line, and all the owners are sitting out there. In reality, what's really the ideal setup for how you ought to configure the board members' tables? How they ought to sit? Yeah. like a U. And why is that? So they can talk to each other, exactly. So you actually give kind of the false impression that you're there for the unit owners and you're talking to them, and really you're not talking to them. You're really talking amongst each other, and they're there to listen. They're there because they have the right to listen in, but it really needs to be focused on talking amongst each other. So you can make it a U like that or a V, but it really does kind of change the dynamic and make it easier for everyone to communicate. Because otherwise, I see it all the time. People looking down, kind of what do you say, and especially when you have a lot of people on the board. Other things are, how many of you have snowbirds that are regularly calling into meetings? Only a few of you? Okay. Well, that's happening more and more, and what I'm seeing is that the most common speakerphone system is you take your cell phone, you turn it up, and you set it down there and try to use that. And that really is not very effective. You get it just makes it difficult for everybody. So it used to be these Polycom systems, and speakerphones were very expensive. They were like $500 or $600. Now you can buy, this is one that you can buy on Amazon. It's wireless. It's wireless, and it's battery operated, and like 7 board members can talk well with it. It's $99.
What's it called?
It's called a Jabber, and you can actually look that up on Florida Association News. And another example is people. It used to be that the audio systems were PA systems, public announcement systems are very expensive, and they're very complicated to get set up. But if you need to do something just on a one-off basis, and you need a speaker system, I found, you're going to think I have Amazon stock. Actually, I do own like a couple shares. But you can buy a karaoke box. I realized this. My son's karaoke box. I have teenage kids. Works fantastic. It's like $140. It's got wheels. It's battery operated, and it works perfect. And you can have a party at the end of the meeting if you want. So again, that's a simple thing you can do. And if you're going to need to have a presentation, making sure that you've got a projector. Little things like that are really important to make sure that you're as effective as you can be, particularly when you've got larger meetings. And then one last final thing is what we just handed out a few minutes ago. If your president doesn't have a gavel, well, if you're a Campbell Property, you automatically get gavels. But if you don't have one, go get one, because it's just a lot easier. It's amazing. It's just kind of a universal thing that you can tap the gavel, and it usually is pretty effective as compared to screaming and yelling. So it's a lot more decorum. So I highly recommend it if you don't have one. Another key one is just establishing time limits. And I'm saying this as much for just when you're preparing the agenda. And typically, I would suggest that the manager and the president would prepare the agenda, and then they would share that with the rest of the board to say, this is what we think the agenda ought to be. And as you're doing it, you wouldn't necessarily write the times on it, but you would think that, all right, look, we're going to talk about replacing all the mailboxes in the community. This should take about 12 minutes or 15 minutes because we've already got the specs, we've had a committee on it, whatever. So kind of think through how long it's going to take. And if you know you're going to have a split decision on it, try to talk to people about it in advance so that you've got a feel for what's going to happen. If you've got a topic on there that says you get the idea that you might have 3 topics that might take 20 minutes, maybe all 3 of those need to get deferred till a later point, and you need to get more detail, you need to get some more consensus on it in advance. So just thinking through it before you get started, because again, newer boards especially, I'll see these newer boards, again, transparency is fantastic, but they'll come in and they'll say we want to be transparent. They'll come in and the first agenda will be like 20 items, and they'll get up there and start brainstorming, and it just makes you look not good when you do that. So it's really important to be prepared and kind of manage the time. The next thing is declaring the ground rules, and this is something that I think, somebody said earlier, bad board meetings, nobody attends. Well, as long as you get a quorum, I would say sometimes it's a good thing if you don't get a lot of owners that don't attend, because that generally implies that people are okay with how things are going. I've been at the meetings when 40% of the people show up, and it's usually not because they're really happy and they want to chime in and say thank you. Usually it's because they're not happy about something. So, but the key with declaring the ground rules is even if you don't have a lot of people show up regularly, new people are going to show up, and it's a good practice to just make sure before you start the meeting. A lot of people might not even ever lived in a homeowners association before. So just to tell them, and it's really short and simple, hey, just to let you know, this is a board meeting, this is for the board to conduct business, we're going to talk amongst each other, and you're here, you have a right to listen in, and you've got a right to speak, and here's your right to speak. You can speak, after we've spoken and before we vote, and just explain it to them. And what I often do too is say, if you have a policy for it, if you don't have a policy for it, we can get you a policy for members' right to speak. Literally put it on the back of the agenda, or hand it out separately. Because what you don't want to do is have to, never say it, and then someone shows up and then they start trying to participate, and then you start telling them, no, you can't say anything. It's a lot easier if you tell them in advance what the rules are. So it's a real simple thing to do, and it'll avoid creating an issue if you've got new people that start showing up. The next one, again, real simple, but people try to break it all the time, is following the agenda. The key reason for this is that, you really don't want to go talking about things off agenda, because otherwise people might have come. If you're going to talk about, banning something or building a new tennis center or something like that, if you're going to start having those conversations, other people might have come if they didn't know it was on the agenda, and that's really the key reason why. Plus also just making sure that you get this thing done in a reasonable, manageable time, because if you start talking about things that you're not prepared for, that's when things really run amok. The next thing is just making sure that you let members speak. And again, you don't want to do it in such a way that they overtake the whole process, but I think it's important to give them their right to speak. And one of the things that I've seen some boards do, which I highly discourage, is you can actually, if you wanted to, you could let them wait until the very end of the meeting and let that be the only time they can speak. And you can do that if you want, but I would suggest that if you have the time to do it, you can manage it effectively. The best way is that if you have a vote coming, before you vote, give them a chance to ask questions or speak briefly, rather than waiting to the end. Because otherwise, you're giving them the right to speak after you've already made the decisions is kind of rude. So they come there to talk about it. So that's a minor thing, but something that really makes sense to consider. The next thing is the parliamentarian side of this thing, making sure you're running things reasonably well, but not going crazy with Robert's rules. So, is anyone in here like a Robert's rules would consider themselves a Robert's rules expert? You back there? Okay. So I would say it's almost like if you were a black belt, don't use it with everybody else because it just wouldn't be fair. So with Robert's rules, try to keep it really simple. You need to have a quorum, you need to commence the meeting, you need to adjourn the meeting, you need to take motions, you need to get seconds, you can table things, but don't get super sophisticated, because what ends up happening is there's also sometimes some of the things in Robert's rules might actually not be compliant with Florida law. So just keep it simple, and don't let anyone run off with it too much, because it just gets everyone else confused. This next one I think is one of the hardest ones, and this is another reason to have a gavel. Don't criticize, condemn, or complain. So who knows who I got that from? Yes?
Dale Carnegie.
Dale Carnegie, exactly. I wish I had another gavel. So this is a great one, and I know it can be really difficult to do. How many of you, I know this happens frequently for me, how many of you have gone into a meeting knowing that someone was going to yell or scream or say something slanderous or mean? How many of you have had that happen where you've known that in advance? Okay, so when you know that in advance, have any of you ever come up with a pre-canned thing that you were going to say that was going to, to just kind of ease it out? Has anyone done that before? I always tell people, just think of something like, no matter what they say, you can say, thank you for your input, although I disagree with what you say and believe it could be slanderous and libelous. We're going to move on from that now, and we're going to continue forward with the rest of the meeting. Or just something. It can be anything you want, but it doesn't include telling them to shut that up, and it doesn't include screaming or throwing the gavel at them. It's just trying to, if you anticipate it, it's amazing how well that works and how it kind of just takes all the frustration out of you. You just feel a lot better when you say it, and it's not because you've known, you've kept your cool. So the last one is something that I'll let, Dan should talk about. I'm sure he'll talk about this in his, and you can ask him about some of the specific legal reasons why not. But minutes, again, I hate to keep picking on new boards, but new boards, I've had a lot of new boards come in and say, oh, the first thing we're going to do is make sure we put a lot more information in those minutes to make sure people know what's really happening in case they weren't there. And that's a really, really bad idea. And again, I understand the reason why, but you don't want to put in things like, Mrs. Johnson mentioned that there was a crack in the sidewalk that, she thinks could be a trip hazard, in this certain area. You want to write it down, you want to go fix it, but you don't want to be writing that kind of stuff down because if anything ever happens down the road, somebody's going to find it. And it's really bad. I mean, I know of a situation where there was a community that someone called the exit turn a death trap, and someone put it in the minutes, and that they should investigate it. And they went and did investigate, and they actually literally petitioned the city to get a stoplight, and they didn't, and they kept trying all things, and eventually someone actually got seriously injured, and it was like a multi-million-dollar suit, and that was an incriminating point, is that somebody put it in there. So again, all you really want is, the real basics. And again, you can look on Campbell on the Florida Association News, and it'll show you exactly what you should and shouldn't have. Who's there, who voted on what, and so on. Just very, very basic. Okay, so that's it. Again, if you want to look at more detail on this, if you go on to Florida Association News, you can actually find a lot more articles like this, blog posts like this, that'll get into more detail. And in fact, I even have I have a blog post in there about the speakerphone. I have a blog post in there about the karaoke machine to be used as a PA system and so on. So, again, if you haven't signed up for Florida Association News, please do before you leave. And at this point, I think we'll turn it over to Dan Wasserstein. Dan? Thank you all. Yeah. If anybody wants to get coffee or whatever for a couple minutes, he's got to just get his computer set up. It'll just take a couple minutes. Yes?
I get the email from the Florida Association too. You archive it.
Yeah, they're all archived. We've been doing it for 8 years, so every blog post, every newsletter ever is all in there. And that's the beauty of it, is that you can go find there's thousands of pieces of information in the group.
How you doing? Very good, very good. We'll be over there for you.
Get started in about 60 seconds, okay? All right, everyone, let's get started, everyone, please, if you could. Do I need the gavel? All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Wasserstein. I thank Dan Tiernan for the presentation that he did for you. I think that's really valuable and practical information I would echo to all of you. And some of it we'll touch upon again as we go through this presentation. just a few things before we get started. I do have the piece of paper that's going to be most important for all of you. That's your certification form. Those I'll be passing out when we take an intermission. I'm going to make those available for you. They're, they're pre-made forms. You just fill in your name, and then you would be wanting to hand that in to your HOA manager or your board or whomever keeps the records for your community, so that they have that on file. It is an official record of your community, and again, it does satisfy the state statute, as I'm an approved instructor. So that's the most important thing you want to come away with here today. Of course, in addition to all the information. As I said, my name is Dan Wasserstein. I'm a community association attorney. All we do at my office all day, every day, me and 3 other attorneys, is represent communities. That's all we do. We don't, we're not doing slip and fall cases. We're not doing trusts and wills for people, even though we get asked to. Strictly represent communities, and predominantly Palm Beach and Broward County, and within that, predominantly large master planned associations, such as the one we're in today. That's, like I said, that's our niche, and I have for now several years been approved to instruct this course. We do it for condominiums as well. The way I'd like to run it today, so that it is not, for lack of a better term, boring or less boring, is to allow you to interact a little bit. So when we have slides, if you have a question on it, a general sort of, well, hey, can you explain this more or something like that? Happy to take those questions. I'd like to have maybe 1 or maybe 2 at most per slide, but I do want it to be interactive because as much in my mind as I'd like to think that you'd like to listen to me stand up here for 2 hours and talk to you, that's probably not the case. So let's get started. Yes? No, we're not going, there might be some intermittently, very sparingly though. Today's presentation is specifically for HOAs. There are a few instances where we will highlight a difference between HOAs and condominium associations, but we're not going to be drawing every distinction that they have. We do have courses that are condo and HOA mixed, but today was a focus just on HOAs, but that's a good question. Okay, so the first thing, board member eligibility. Of course, the Florida law sets forth what you need to have to be eligible for the board of directors. First thing, you need to be a natural person. Can anyone tell me what a natural person is? Right. Yeah. Yes.
A corporation that has a representative.
Good. That's very good. The way I say it, a human being is a natural person, meaning that if your property is owned by XYZ LLC, XYZ LLC can't be a board member. You, as a member of the corporation, as a human being, can serve on the board, just like a beneficiary of a trust, or of course, like most of us own our homes in our own name, we are eligible to serve, but an entity cannot serve. So good, that was very good. Of course, be 18 years of age or older, that's certainly common sense. Not be delinquent in the payment of any monetary obligation owed to the association. That means to be eligible to serve on the board at the time of your election, when you put in your name to be a candidate, you can't owe a penny to your association. That can be anything: assessments, late fees, fines. Any monetary obligation you have can disqualify you. Yes? We're going to get to that later. So we'll hit that later. That's a very good question, and that'll be coming up shortly as far as what happens once you've now gotten on the board and you or another board member becomes delinquent. Yes?
If I'm a homeowner, but I'm not on a deed, can I run?
That's going to be dependent on your documents, but probably not. You need to be, most associations require that members of the association are the ones who are eligible to serve on the board. And the statute in your documents most likely define member to be a record title holder. So if you're not on the deed, then there's a very strong likelihood that the answer is no. Yes?
If that is the case, then how come one of the requirements is that you don't have to live in the development?
Again, we can't have specific to your community questions, but I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question about living in.
I'm looking say that the person must live in the development.
Right, there is no requirement. You can own a home. You can own a home right where we are now in Parkland, golf and tennis, is that what it is? Golf, okay. And you might own it and live in Nebraska. You're eligible to be on the board. You don't have to live here unless your bylaws say that you have to live in the community to serve on the board of directors. Now, there was some legislation proposed last year and actually this year that they're trying to propose that only people who live in the community or live there for a certain number of months can serve as board members, and I can tell you that has zero chance of passing. If you own the property, that's the keystone for board service for most communities. Yes?
Do you have to personally own it, or can you have the trust that, and you're the beneficiary of the trust?
If you're the beneficiary of the trust, you can serve on the board. There's case law to that effect. Yes? Okay. So, another item here, if you're a convicted felon, if your rights have been restored for more than 5 years, you're eligible to serve on the board. Now, members of the board are selected in many different ways. Are any of you still under developer control? Yes, one? Okay, so generally if you're under developer control, they appoint the first board, they control the board until what's called turnover or transition. Once they turn over, the members are allowed to elect a majority of the board. And you are all mostly, the rest of you are all well past that point. And of course, now you're at the third point here, where after transition, you're holding your periodic elections, whether every year, every 2 years, or whatever the case may be. And of course, when a vacancy occurs on the board, generally speaking, the remaining board members have the authority to fill the vacancy, unless your bylaws dictate otherwise. And sometimes we have instances, someone drops off the board, maybe it's a week after the election, and the board will say, hey, you know, Mary Smith finished in 5th place, or 6th place for our 5-member board. Do we just let Mary take the spot now because the other board member quit? And the answer is no. You can choose to appoint her, but it's entirely in your discretion. This is for your all board members here. This is good for you because you have the option to hold an election for that other spot. But most boards say, well, if given the choice, if we can choose our replacement board member, as opposed to putting it back out for a vote, spending the money, and who knows who we get, we can pick and choose. That's pretty attractive to most boards, and that's what they opt to do, and it's the most efficient way of filling vacancies, and highly recommended that you do that. And then, of course, the person who fills the vacancy generally fills it for the unexpired term. Once in a while, your bylaws will deviate from that and might make it a shorter window of time. Like, let's say you have 2-year terms. Some bylaws will say that if a vacancy is filled, they only fill it to the next election, which could be less than the remaining term. It could be, let's say, 6 months from now. And there might be a year and a half remaining on that term. So you have to check your bylaws, but most of them you fill for the remaining term. They don't get, so that's another distinction that's important. Sometimes boards have said, well, so-and-so came on the board as an appointee, they get a 2-year term. And I say, they don't get 2 years from today, their 2 years runs from the person's shoes they're filling. So again, it's still, you're keeping that same term, they're just stepping in for the rest of it. Was there a question back there? Yes?
If a board member falls off, you know, they leave, do you have to fill that spot? If you have, say, 7 people already on the board, so there's 6.
If your bylaws, that's going to be heavily dependent on your bylaws. The statute uses words like may, and a lot of people think that you must, and that's not necessarily the case. You have to fill the vacancy if the vacancy puts you under quorum. Like, let's say you have a 5-person board, and you have 3 people quit. You have to fill at least 1 vacancy to have a quorum of 3. Otherwise, you could be put into receivership. There's a whole other story. But generally, there's not an absolute requirement, although we strongly recommend that you do fill those vacancies, especially if there are people willing to serve. I have some boards that have vacancies that are open, you know, not for a month or 2 until the next election, but let's say 8 or 9 months. And there's someone willing to serve, and they say, well, we don't like that guy, and we don't know anyone else who wants to serve, and we don't want him on the board, so we're not going to do it. Well, guess what? In that community, it was 3 years ago, that guy ended up suing the association saying they had all these many months. I wrote 3 letters to them willing to serve, and they wouldn't put me on the board when no one else was willing to step up. And they got sanctioned by the DBPR for that. So it's not a must unless your documents set forth, or unless it would put you below quorum. The number of board members, that's another question that's always comes up. It's generally going to be fixed in your bylaws, your articles. Are you a 3-person board? Are you 5? I have one board that's, I think, 23 board members, because they have it's a condo, they have one for every building. They have 23 board members. As you can imagine, their meetings are insane. So the number of board members is going to be set by your documents. In an HOA, unlike condo, and there's a distinction, condo statute, if you don't have anything in your bylaws, you have to have 5. There's no such provision in the HOA statute, so it's entirely directed by your bylaws. Now, interesting distinction. Let's say you're set up as a 7-person board, and many of you have bylaws, articles that say the board can be as low as 3 and as many as 9. Have you guys seen that before? Okay. So what they think is that that's just a floating number and based on participation. Meaning, hey, this year we only got 5 people who wanted to serve. We're a 7-person board, we've always been, but only 5 people want to serve this year, so we're going to be a 5-person board. And I tell them that's not correct. You're still a 7-person board, you only have 5 of 7 of your seats filled. You can, and usually your bylaws will spell out how you do this, you can vote, either by your members or your board, depending again on your bylaws, to shrink or increase the size within that range, the 3 to 9. But once it's established, until you vote to change it, that is your board size, regardless of participation. So if you again have that 7-person board and only 3 people participate in your election, you only have 3 board members, you now only have 3 out of 7, meaning you don't have a quorum, you need to get at least 1 more, or you need to have a vote to shrink the size of your board. So that's an important distinction. It doesn't float with participation. And then, of course, the last item here on board size is you're generally going to serve for 1 year until the next annual meeting. Sometimes you'll have 2-year terms, sometimes 3-year terms. I'm sure, how many of you are on 1-year terms? Okay, it looks like about a third. HOAs often have 2. How many of you are on 2? All right, yeah, I see a good amount there. Anyone more than 2? No more than 2? Oh, 1 more than 2. All right. So, you see that, you see more commonly in condos, you'll see 1-year terms. All right, so now we're going to get to your election procedure. How did you guys get here today, right? It's conducted pursuant to your governing documents. Unfortunately, the condo statute is fantastic for elections. But guess what? You don't get to benefit yourself from the condo statute. Condo statute sets forth exactly how you go through the process. Every residential condo in the state of Florida, exactly the same process. Makes it very easy and manageable. Guess what? Your HOAs, you guys, every single one of you is unique to your own documents. And I have documents that have all sorts of crazy things for HOAs. For example, one of my clients, they don't get quorum, they have to try 4 times at lower thresholds. They have to renotice the meeting. They can't just roll over, they have to keep trying. So every HOA is different based on your documents. How you're voted in, it could be by proxy in an HOA, it could be by secret ballot, or it could be by open ballot. It depends on what your documents dictate. When it comes to being elected or being nominated, you can nominate yourself. You don't have to have someone else say, I nominate Joe Smith to be a member of the board. You can say, I nominate myself. No one needs to second it. You're free to do that. And the way many associations will operate for HOAs now is they will call for candidates in advance of the meeting through a mailing. They'll set up a process, or their bylaws are already set up to allow for candidates to nominate themselves in advance. Then you'll get another notice saying, here are the candidates, please vote for them. How many of you have advanced nomination process? Okay, it looks like a lot of you. So, if you have that process in place, when you come to your HOA meeting, your annual meeting, you do not need to take nominations from the floor. For many years, up until about 4 years ago, When you had your HOA election, you still had to take nominations from the floor, even if you had people nominate themselves in advance, or a committee nominate them in advance. You do not have to do that anymore. The law changed, regardless of what your bylaws may say. So that's a good benefit. Yes?
What is the definition of a limited proxy?
A limited proxy is a document. So that's a good question. A limited proxy has what's called limited powers in it. And the way we draft them is we make it very clear. We put a box in the middle that says limited powers. And what that means is that is the instruction the homeowner is giving to the person they name as proxy, how they want to vote. So let's say there's a question at the meeting on an amendment. And the question in the limited power section will say, I vote yes, or it'll say, do you want to approve the amendments, yes or no? And if I'm the homeowner and I check yes, and I give you, what's your name? Ann. I give Ann. I write Ann as my proxy, and I check yes. When you go to the meeting on my behalf and cast that vote, as to that issue, that limited issue, you have to vote yes for me. The limited proxy will also dictate any other limitations on powers. Whereas a general proxy is basically Ann's going to go to the meeting, and whatever issues come up, she can vote her conscience for me. So that's the distinction versus a limited versus a general proxy. Yeah, back in the back.
Yes. If you send your homeowners a limited proxy just to establish the quorum for the annual meeting, if you don't get enough back, do you have to hold the annual meeting?
No, if you don't have quorum, you can't hold the meeting. So a limited proxy, and some of them they'll call it a quorum proxy. Sometimes for your meetings, if your annual meeting, if you're voting by ballot, then the proxy, unless you have other business, is only for the purpose of establishing quorum. You need for HOAs, you'll all need 30% quorum to hold your membership meetings, like an annual meeting. And if you don't get enough proxies plus people in person to reach your quorum level, you cannot have a meeting. In fact, I was at a meeting a few weeks ago where a woman was insisting, I was the president of my board, and even if we don't have quorum, we still have to take minutes and hold in business. And I said, I'm sorry, I appreciate you serve, but you're entirely wrong. If there is no quorum, there is no meeting, there are no minutes. You are just a group of homeowners sitting in a building together. At that moment in time, they're free to discuss whatever you want, but there'll be no official record of it, there'll be no voting on anything, etc. One more question, yes?
All right, I'm sorry. On the limited proxy, and I understand if there's a proposed question, how about if the candidates' names are listed, right, and the limited proxy comes out with the name, and the person is not going to be there for the election, can that person, the absentee homeowner, designate another homeowner to vote on their behalf so that it becomes a secret ballot as opposed to a limited proxy ballot?
That's very specific to your community. You have to check your documents for that. Unfortunately, that's a very rare process, because if you're voting by, usually if it's a general proxy election, there's no naming the candidates. The alternative is by ballot, which a ballot would be a separate document that the owner turns in, not as part of the proxy. I'll do one more. Yes? Yeah. My HOA too. I live in Boca Raton. We've never had a quorum. I've lived there for 5 years. We haven't had a quorum once. And you know what I say to that? I say that means, you know what, if you don't have a quorum, that means people must be, as Dan Tiernan said earlier, people must be pretty happy with the way things are going. That or indifferent. But let me tell you this, if people were unhappy with the way things were going, you can be sure they would be knocking on doors and showing up. I can tell you, my community 2 years ago, there were about 20 people, as you know, every community has, who just wanted to change things just for the sake of change, right? And they were at the annual meeting, and they were mad at the board, blaming the board of directors. You guys conspired to not get a quorum. It's your fault. It's management's fault. We want to have an election. And you know what? I stood up. I said, look, I do this every day, all day. I live here. And I'm going to tell you, it's not the board's fault. It's not management's fault. I looked at the guy and said, it's your fault. And he was shocked, and he said, what do you mean it's my fault? I said, if you look to the left of your house and the right of your house, did you go knock on their door and get them to submit a proxy? Did you do anything to try to help get a quorum? No, well, guess what? All he did was post on Facebook how unhappy he was with everything, and that we need to have an election, but he did nothing proactive. And when it came to that day, he wanted to point the finger at everyone else. So I'll tell you, if you're ever faced with that conundrum or that question, you want to make sure the owners understand it's not management's burden, it's not the board's burden to get quorum, it's the community's. And if you don't get quorum, like I said, I look at it like, hey, everyone's pretty happy here. Yes?
So if you don't have quorum, we never have quorum. It says that we can't have annual meetings, then how do we elect?
You don't. If you, in an HOA, unless your bylaws are set up similar to like a condominium, which I won't go into the details, but unless they have that exception, you do not have an election. So what does that mean? Two things. One, you can adjourn the meeting by a vote of those members who are there, a majority of those members, to continue and try again. And your proxies you have are good for 90 days, so you want to reschedule it within 90 days, and then you can try to go out and get more people to participate. Alternatively, and what most associations do though, is the board will just roll over, and meaning that the board stays as they are until your next annual meeting. So those are the two alternatives. Yes?
But in the COA, you can't use proxies for voting election.
Right, again, the condo association, I don't want to confuse everyone too much with that. Condo's a different process. Condo's only balloting, there's no proxies or anything like that in it, and you don't need to have quorum, totally different process. HOAs you do. Okay, let's go on. If you have other questions on this, I'm going to stick around at the end, so feel free to come talk to me when this is when we're done here. All right, moving on. Again, we've talked the election process is largely driven by the governing documents. We've talked about actually most of this slide, so I'm going to skip over this. You can read it at your leisure, but we've already actually talked about this through the questions. Board compensation. How many of you get paid for being on your board of directors? Show of hands. No one? You get paid in insults and stress and anxiety, right? Okay, no one ever comes. Actually, I should say no one. Very rarely do people come to your meetings and say, I just showed up because I want to thank you. You guys are fantastic, right? Yeah, usually that's not the case. Anyway, we're talking about compensation, monetary compensation. Generally speaking, you're not going to get compensated. You can be compensated if it's authorized in advance by a majority of the voting interests of your association. Show of hands, how many of you think a majority of your members would vote to pay you a salary to be on the board of directors? Right? Yeah, okay. So, honestly, I think you would get a lot better board participation in communities if there was some sort of compensation. And I can tell you, when I represent commercial condominiums, like a strip mall or something, those people usually vote, or I should say usually, often vote that they will compensate the board members. It's a nominal amount, but it's because they want people who have a vested interest, because it's an investment for them, and it's their business. And I say, well, your home's your investment too. I'd be happy to chip in a few bucks, to get people really interested in being on the board. But the reality of it is people hear money and for something that's traditionally free, and they don't want to pay for it. So that's that. Abandonment of office. Who asked the question earlier about you asked about the board member that becomes delinquent. Here you go. All right, so when a board member, now we're not talking about running for the board. Running for the board, you have a clear slate, no debt. Once you are on the board of directors, you get a little more slack, because they don't want people constantly dropping off when they become a penny behind. It would be a little chaotic for a board. So you get a 90-day cushion. And that is, again, any monetary obligation. It used to only say assessments. About 5-6 years ago, it was changed to say any monetary obligation. Again, that can include interest, late fees. Most commonly, what it might include in some of these instances are fines, when the owner, the board member themselves has been fined and says, well, I'm not going to pay it. Well, guess what? If you don't pay it in 90 days, you're considered to be off your board. I actually had this happen in a community in Boynton I represented about 4 or 5 years ago. They had a president who'd been the president forever. New board members were looking for a way to, for all intents and purposes, get rid of him. And they realized he had a fine sitting on his account for 2 years or something that he hadn't paid, $100. They asked me, I said, he's considered to have abandoned his seat. So they notified him. He walked in with the $100, said, I'm sorry, here's the $100. I'll pay it. I'm not going to dispute it anymore. Let me back on the board. And guess what? It is not a suspension. You are gone. So the board could have chosen to appoint him because now he had a clean slate and he was an eligible person that could be appointed. And as you can imagine, they did not appoint him. They appointed someone else. So that's the other distinction. One of my board members said once, well, you know, I've fallen on hard times. He lost his job. I felt bad for the guy. But I said, look, you got to pay. And, you know, they had quarterly assessments. And he said, well, you know, if I go into the next quarter, I'll just pay it when I have to. I'll get it in 4 months from now. I said, Bob, you can't do that, Bob, because you're going to be off the board. And he thought, well, they'll just put me, I just automatically, when I pay, I go back on. Not the case. So an important distinction, yes.
If you're involved in disputed litigation where somebody claims you owe money and you file it, deny you owe the money. Are you doing it because somebody else said you should listen, or because there's been a court determination that you do?
That's a good question. Generally, it's going to be based on the books and records of the association. If someone has tangible proof and they're disputing that they owe the money, then I would probably advise the board that in that moment not to suspend them or deem them having abandoned their spot if the amounts are in dispute, unless the dispute is unreasonable. Look, if someone's on the board and they have no basis they're just saying, well, I think I paid. Okay, well, do you have a check, return check? Do you have some sort of online payment you made, a credit card proof of payment? No. Well, then I'm going to probably tell the board, well, unless they come up with something tangible, I would consider them having abandoned. But that's a good question, and that's where it can get a little hairy. That's a perfect opportunity to consult legal counsel. Yes, back there.
So say you have a board member that is delayed to 90 days, or it could even be a lot longer than that. Whose job is it to say something? I mean, because nothing will happen.
Generally, it's going to be your board and/or your manager and/or your lawyer. That's something where, it's an uncomfortable conversation. In the case I just explained, it was his fellow board members. They, wrote him an email and said, we're, per the attorney's guidance in the state statute, unfortunately, you're no longer a board, we're no longer considering you a board of directors member, and they instructed the manager to remove his name from sunbiz.org that lists all the board members of the Department of State. And,
What if you just let it go, though? What if somebody said, is that bad?
If you let it go, I mean, look, that you shouldn't let it go, but it's not going to invalidate the board's actions or anything like that. The board effectively is ratifying those actions every time they have another meeting, but it should be something that you're mindful of, and something that certainly, when you have your meetings, I'm sure your management company will usually provide you the delinquency report, and I can tell you one of the first things that board members will notice is when one of their fellow board members pops up on that report. And so again, something to be mindful of.
Thank you.
Election of officers, again, continuing on here. We've talked about directors. Now we're going to talk about officers. Officers are your president, your vice president, treasurer, secretary. You are going to nominate and elect them from amongst yourselves. So sometimes we have you have your election and you go right into your organizational meeting to elect your officers. And a crowd of your homeowners say, okay, well now we're going to vote on who's the president. Or isn't the president the guy who got the most or woman who got the most votes? No, unless your documents dictate that, the answer is no. The board of directors nominate from amongst themselves, again, unless your bylaws have something different. Generally speaking, you nominate from amongst yourselves. Someone can self-nominate, someone else can nominate a person on the board and say, I'd like to nominate Mary to be the board president. Of course, in that example, Mary has to accept the nomination. She can't just, you can't nominate someone and force them into forced labor here as the president of the board of directors. But that's the way in which you're nominated to an officer position. We do recommend that you meet as soon as possible to elect your officers because you want those roles established right away so the business can be conducted properly. So that checks can be signed, contracts or invoices approved, things like that. Generally, most associations will have their organizational meeting to do this right after your election. How many of you do that? How many of you do it right after? Okay. So, yeah, most of you will. The statute and your documents will give you 10 days, though, to get it done, if you don't do it immediately. And sometimes, look, sometimes you have an election, you don't have a quorum of the board there. So you end up, having to postpone that. But it has to be done within 10 days. Yes? Okay, so that's a good question as far as how many officers can you have and who can sign checks. Number of officers, again, is going to be dictated by your documents. If your documents are silent, you have to have at least a president, a treasurer, and a secretary. Now, in some associations, they have vice secretary, we have vice presidents, we have first vice president, second vice president, third vice president. Everyone wants a title, right? So, it's dependent on your documents and what they say as far as how many officers. Most associations, how many of you have the four? President, vice president, treasurer, secretary. Right, so that's the vast majority of you are set up that way, and that's traditional. As far as who can sign the checks, that's generally going to be the president and the treasurer, and sometimes it'll have to take both of them, but it can also be other board members depending on how that's determined in your bylaws and your articles. Okay, let's see here. The last bullet point I'll highlight here is that the board members, when it comes to electing officers, this is the only time as board members, that's why I put it in red there, that you can vote secretly. All your other votes, when you vote as board members, you have to vote yes or no in the presence of everyone. It gets put in the minutes whether you voted yes or no. It's open. When I say vote secretly, I don't mean you go hold your organizational meeting in a back room. And that's another distinction that's important. Some of my boards say, oh, when we hold our organizational meeting, we don't do that in the presence of the membership. I can tell you that's entirely wrong. You need to hold your organizational meeting. It is a board meeting. It's held in the presence of everyone. The voting, how you vote, is seen by everyone, unless, like I said, you vote secretly. So I have one board, every year they have 9 board members, they want to vote secretly every year. It's the same people every year, and there's 4 people who are friends, and another 4 people who are friends, and a poor lady in the middle, and I don't know why they vote secretly, because everyone knows there's a 960 unit community. Everyone that's there in the audience knows how everyone's voting, but they insist secret. They use little pieces of paper. They vote for the president that way, the vice president, etc. They're allowed to do it. Again, everyone knows who's voting for who, but that's the way they've chosen to go about it. Yes?
So what you're saying is that as soon as the election is over, the old board is out, the new board sits, calls a meeting to order, and the first order of business is the election.
And the first order of business is the appointment of officers, yes. So if right after your election, if your organizational meeting has been scheduled, so most of the time your annual meeting notice will say organizational meeting to immediately follow annual meeting. So as long as it's scheduled, and as long as you have a quorum of the board present or available by phone, then yes, you would hold your organizational meeting, yes.
So that's the new board takes over immediately after the annual meeting.
Effectively, as soon as the election results are read, those are the board members.
Everyone is there, and that meeting has to be called an official meeting, and at that meeting, elections take place.
Correct. All right. Moving on, election of officers. Again, we've talked about some of this, so I'm going to move on from this slide. Let's see, we've talked about the rest of that. So let's go into the positions of the officers here. Actually, before we do that, let's highlight some of the bullets here. So, first of all, individuals can hold more than one office. That's dependent on your governing documents. As you can imagine, if you have a 3-person board and you have 4 officer positions, someone has to double up. Now, the president and the secretary should never be one and the same, because the secretary, many times, for example, signing things that have to be recorded in the public records, the secretary has to effectively attest to the president's signature. And what does that mean? It just means the president and the secretary both sign the document. But the secretary can't complete that function if they are the president. So they should be separate. I recommend usually that Of course, the vice president should not be the president, because of course, if the president, let's say we had a president that was in the hospital for 4 months, the vice president stepped up into that person's shoes and took over the running of the board for that period of time. Of course, if that person who was in the hospital was both president and vice president, they would have had to have a reorganizational meeting to fill that spot. So we just want to be mindful, not doubling up on things that shouldn't or cannot be doubled up. And again, it might depend on your documents. Your documents might prohibit certain positions from being doubled up. And the last point, officers serve at the discretion of the board. So generally speaking, you can't kick a fellow board member off, with limited exception. But generally, only your membership can vote to kick off a board member. That's called the recall process. So, what can you do? Well, officers serve at the discretion of the board, meaning if you have someone who is the president or the treasurer, for example, you as the board can vote them out of office. They would still be on the board, they're still a director, but they no longer will hold that spot, that officer position. So that is within your discretion as a majority of the remaining board members to do that, and basically what's called reorganize your board. You can do that anytime. We had a guy who was the president of a board, he lasted for 1 week. Then the rest of the board held a meeting, and they kicked him out of the president's spot, and he said, well, if I can't be the president, I quit. And that was one of the shortest term presidents I've seen in an HOA. So, remember, it's something you can be mindful of, and something you can do. The president, we'll go through these somewhat quickly unless you have questions on them. As you can imagine, the president not runs, but they're like the CEO of your community. They preside at the meetings, generally speaking. Everyone who got that gavel, generally those are the presidents who, control the meeting. They control the flow, going through the agenda, unless they delegate that to someone else. But they control the meetings of the board, and usually they will chair the meetings of the membership as well. Importantly, they will execute contracts, orders, and other documents. So they're going to sign checks. When you have let's say you need to hire a landscaping company, you as a board vote for that collectively, but it's your president ultimately who is signing that contract. And it's important when signing those documents, the president wants to, and I recommend that they designate they're signing it as president of XYZ HOA. Just sometimes people are concerned, well, I don't want to have any personal liability. I'm not hiring them as Dan Wasserstein. I'm hiring them as the president of the board. So if it doesn't say a title or there's no heading above the signature that has the name of the association and it's just a signature line, I will advise them to say, why don't you put it there as president of and name your association. Yes?
Can the president discharge a contract, or does the board have to discharge a contract?
Unless the board has voted to give the president that unilateral authority, which most don't, you'd have to have done that in a meeting by a resolution. No, the president, by virtue of being the president, does not have the authority to discharge or terminate contracts. That is the board that would vote to do that, and then the president could sign the letter of termination, but it's not the president's purview unless it's voted to give him or her that authority. Some other things the president does, the day-to-day administration, when one of your managers from Campbell, let's say, calls you and says, hey, we need to fix a bush that's dying, it's going to cost $50, can we go ahead and do it? Sure. That's the president that's going to control that. Your day-to-day minor sort of, operational sort of expenses. They serve as a spokesman for the board, again, when it's dealing with, maybe it might be dealing with your attorney, or dealing with your CPA or insurance agent. Usually, it's going to be the president or someone else. Maybe sometimes some boards will designate the treasurer to deal with the attorney when it comes to, let's say, delinquencies and collections. Or they might delegate the manager to handle those things on their behalf. So, but in the default of that, it's going to be the president that, communicates with people on behalf of the board. Of course, the president has an obligation, as do all the officers, to carry out their responsibilities in the best interest of the association. And again, we talked about earlier, they serve at the will of the board, just like all the other officers. Vice president sounds nice, but similar to the vice president of the United States and any other vice president in a democratic process or environment, they are really there to serve in the absence of the president, and independently, they don't really have much to do. And, you know, that's kind of highlighted on the slide. You'll see vice presidents sometimes, they will maybe chair a committee or multiple committees. And again, they would step up in the absence of the president. If it's a temporary absence, they can serve in that capacity. And that's really the role of the vice president. There's not too much obligation that goes with it on a day-to-day basis. The secretary, how many of you are secretaries in here? Anyone? Okay, we got a few. You're responsible for keeping and maintaining a record of all the meetings, the owners and of the board. You're the custodian for the official records. Of you who raised your hand, how many of you keep the official records at your home? You keep at your home. You keep the records at your house? Okay. So that's the point of this one. You'll see the next slide on the treasurer slide. There's duties that are traditional for the secretary, and keeping the minutes. Maybe you keep the minutes. How many of you keep the minutes as secretary? Okay, sometimes that's delegated to your manager, but that's good. But most secretaries, in fact all of them that I'm aware of, they're not keeping their records in their home. They have their management company, and the management company is a custodian of the records. So, you know, you want to make sure if you're a secretary and you happen to have your record, your official records, I'm going to advise you, you shouldn't have them in your personal property if you do. You want to have them at another location because you don't want anyone to say that, you know, you have unfettered access to them and things like that. But again, these are things traditionally your management company is going to handle for you. Again, we talked about that the secretary will keep minutes. And I know Dan Tiernan talked earlier about the minutes. He's absolutely right. Your minutes are not as if you had a court stenographer there to write down everything everyone said. We have homeowners sometimes, they call our managers furious. The minutes don't reflect, I stood up and for 5 minutes said this, this, and this, and I want it in the minutes. Well, they kindly reply and say, we're sorry, sir, but that's not what the minutes are for. The minutes are not a recitation of what everyone said about everything that happened. The minutes are generally, they're going to say what time the meeting was called to order, that there's proof of notice, that there was quorum. It's going to have the agenda items that were, and how they were voted on, meaning who made a motion, was it seconded, who was it seconded by, who voted yes, who voted no, did it pass or not pass, and that for all your agenda items, and then an adjournment. And that's really all the minutes should have. A brief recitation, a snapshot, almost like a bullet point sort of summary of what happened, not a encyclopedia version, a post-it note version. Yes? Sure, Florida law allows, and we'll get to that in the meetings, but Florida law allows not only the board, but allows homeowners to record, tape record, or audio record your meetings. So that's permissible. You can adopt rules regarding how they do it, that they can't be walking around the room as they're videoing it, and things like that, that they have to give advance notice, but that's, they are absolutely allowed to do that, your homeowners. And that goes for board or membership meetings. So just some other information there on the secretary. The treasurer, again, the treasurer is a custodian of the funds, securities and financial records. Of course, you're not, most treasurers are not handling the day-to-day affairs like you would as if you were a treasurer of a major corporation, because again, these are voluntary positions, you're not getting paid to do it, but you have like a supervisory sort of role that you're going to use, whether it's management or your CPA, when it comes to the funds and financial affairs of the association. You're going to help them. Traditionally, the treasurer, and probably other board members, are going to help with adopting the budget every year. The treasurer might be signing checks or approving checks, and when you're doing your yearly audit, the treasurer might be helping your CPA with your yearly financial audit, or if you're doing a lower level of reporting. So that's the traditional role of the treasurer, as you can imagine. Yes?
We currently have, as our treasurer, she is board appointed, but she is not a board member.
Yeah, that's dependent on your governing documents, but most associations, not most, I shouldn't say most. There are many associations that make it permissible that officers do not have to be members of the community. I just dealt with a condo this very week that had a gentleman who was appointed to actually be the president of the board, and their bylaws specifically say that officers must be owners. So in that instance, it's prohibited. And if your bylaws or articles state that, it would be prohibited. But there's no requirement that officers be members of the board. Yes?
And a Florida statute says exactly that.
I'm sorry.
Florida statute says exactly that.
It's not what it says, it's what it doesn't say. It doesn't say that officers must be members of the board of directors. So again, that's why I'd say you have to look to your individual community documents to determine whether that's viable or not. Okay? The treasurer does not have the authority to bind the association. We talked earlier, does the president unilaterally have the authority to bind the association by virtue of being the president? No. Same goes for the treasurer, the secretary, and the vice president. Again, they need to have authority after a board vote to bind the association. They can't just by virtue of saying, well, I'm the treasurer, I'm ordering this, that, and the other to happen. And I see that sometimes we'll see with board members. You know, a landscaper will go to the manager and say, hey, you know, so-and-so told me they're a board member or they're the president of the board, and that they, not the president, but let's say the treasurer of the board, and they said, you know, we want you to plant this, remove that, and get rid of this tree over here, and then do it because I'm a board member, and I told you so. And well, you know, you need to make sure that your board members understand the scope of their authority and that they can't do those sorts of things. Let's see what else we have here. Let's move on. Fiduciary relationship. Anyone know what a fiduciary relationship is? A term you hear all the time. Who can tell me what a fiduciary relationship is? I guess if you're looking at the screen, you might get some hints, but anyone have any ideas? No? That's usually the response. No, no one knows. What the heck is a fiduciary relationship? Yes?
The primary responsibility is to the client.
Right. So that's a good example. It's when you have a responsibility to do something or manage the affairs, the money, or the business of someone else. So if I give an advisor some money and I say, invest this for me, like a stockbroker, they have a fiduciary relationship. They're going to make decisions with my money on my behalf. Well, the board, the members of the board, stand in a fiduciary relationship to the association. You're using their money, the assessments that the community collects, and you're making decisions for the community. So you have obligations of trust and confidence, obligations of loyalty. For example, I had a board member once that said, well, I don't think we should do a special assessment to resurface the pool, even though it's probably needed because I don't use the pool, and I don't care, and I don't want to be specially assessed for it. Well, guess what? I told them you have a duty of loyalty to the community. You have to take off your owner hat, put on your president of the board hat. Is this the best for the community? And ultimately, they ended up going forward with it. But those are the sorts of things that you have to think of when you're a board member. And the last item we'll hit on later, board members, we're talking about a relationship, your relationship to the community here. You can, as a board member, contract with your community through a company you own or individually, and there's a process for it. I recommend that you never do it. Even if you have the best intentions and say, well, you know, I had a community once where someone was a realtor, and the community had taken title to a property in foreclosure. This was 8 years ago. And the realtor said, well, and on the board said, well, my company will list it, and we'll only charge 1% instead of traditional 3%. And the board said, great. They didn't ask me. They said, okay, great, that sounds good. And guess what? When they went to the meeting and they made the disclosure and said, well, you know, I'll use the name Steve, hypothetically. Steve's going to give us a great deal. Guess what the community said? Not thank you, Steve, for giving us a break. Anyone else is going to charge us 3%. You know what they said? They said, we can't believe this. You're taking money. You're making money off the association. That's the only reason you're on the board. So I will tell you, doing that, it's not necessarily a legal problem, but it becomes a political problem and not one I recommend. It's not worth it. Like they say, no good deed goes unpunished, right? So, you know, that was the end of that. Solicitations of goods or services. This is a whole section. Basically, don't take bribes. Don't take things in exchange for people contracting with your community. You are allowed to consume food or get trade fair sort of items. And it says that at a trade fair, I highlighted were educational programs. So eating the food you're eating today and taking home any other little knickknacks or things you might from a trade fair or from something like this is you're allowed to do as long as they're not worth more than $25. So, you know, someone at a trade fair says, hey, I'd love to give you a big TV. You shouldn't take it unless, like, sometimes they do raffles, that's fine. But if it's a direct, like, I'm giving you, sir, you're getting a giant TV because I really like the community you live in and I want to be your lawyer, that's what they're trying to prevent. So you want a big TV? Okay, meetings of the board. I know that Dan touched on this, so some of this we'll go through quicker. A board meeting, of course, is the gathering of a quorum of the board. That means if you, let's say you have a 5-person board, if you and 2 of your board member friends go sit at the pool, and you guys start talking about board member business, that's considered a board meeting. You're supposed to notice that. And that's where, you know, people will start saying, you're holding an illegal meeting, you're talking about board business. Technically, they're not wrong. So, just something to be mindful. I have one community, they have a 5-member board, and when they want to talk about business, they have an office in their clubhouse. They have 2 people at a time go in and out. I can't believe they do it, but it's a retirement community. They go in and one person shares information with the other, then one of them comes out, another one goes in, and they kind of rotate in twos, because guess what? They have the pool area, and someone complained about them, so that's what they do, and now you know what? No one can say otherwise. Yes? Yeah, you're not allowed to have friends. Sorry. You can, look, you're allowed to, the entire board can get together and talk about the Super Bowl or the weather or whatever you want. It's only if you start talking about association business that you start to go into a gray area. Yes?
Specifically, if you have like a committee has a meeting, if you go to that meeting as a board member, there's 3 or 4 other board members there.
Yeah. No, not at all. That's a committee meeting, not a board meeting. You're not discussing or taking up board business. The committee is taking up committee business, and that's perfectly fine. Yes? Email is perfectly fine. The statute was actually amended last year to match the condo statute, which was amended about 3 years ago, to say that discussion by email is okay amongst the board. And that's something I was going to highlight. That's something that is okay. But what you can't do is you can't take votes and say, well, you know, and you can't do like, well, what if we just made it like a poll? I'm like, well, it's the same thing as a vote. You know, sometimes they say, well, hypothetically, if we were to vote to hire this landscaper, you know, what does everyone think? And it's in an email. They all say, well, I'd vote yes, I'd vote yes. That's not, you shouldn't be doing that. But if the questions were, if the email was, I interviewed this landscaper, they have great prices, I talked to this other community, they have good service, and someone else chimes in and says, well, I heard bad things about them, but I heard good things about this one, that's the type of conversation you can have by email. Yes?
What if the email doesn't go to everyone on the board?
You're allowed, you don't have to converse with everyone, there's no obligation that if you want to converse with one of your fellow board members about something, you're not making decisions, that's perfectly fine.
But what if the decision is made without?
There can't be decisions made by email, so that should never happen. Yes?
What about emergency conditions? Let's say you have a contract, you got it falling out, and you're gone. You need a vital security, for instance, or gate guard or something like that.
Yeah, you can.
Before and then have a meeting later.
Yeah, the board in emergency, it has to be a true emergency. Sometimes people say, well, you know, we have, so-and-so quit who was, you know, our tennis, you know, club, you know, manager or something like that. I said, look, that's not an emergency, it's not urgent. But yeah, if you have something like a pipe bursts in like a building, let's say the clubhouse here, a pipe blows up and it's water all over the place, and you need to hire a plumber, you do that on an emergency basis. Generally, the president's going to delegate that under emergency powers, and you just ratify that at a later date. Yes?
What if the meeting is called, Quorum meeting is called, Vice President, and it's posted, but it says we will not conduct any voting at that meeting, and members will be allowed to attend.
Well, a member, first of all, you can have a meeting, I'm not sure what they would be discussing. You can have a meeting that's just this discussion, a workshop. Yeah, yeah, whatever you call it. If it's a quorum of the board gathered together, it's a board meeting, and whatever you discuss by Florida statute, and we'll get to it, your owners, and as Dan Tiernan said earlier, have an absolute right to have an opportunity to comment on the designated items of business, whatever those may be. Even if you're not calling for a vote, if there are action items being discussed, then you have to give your members an opportunity to talk, and they get 3 minutes. You have to give them by statute at least 3 minutes to say whatever they'd like to say about that item. It's only limited to that item, yes.
What if members of the board want them to vote at that meeting before something like discussed?
The only way you can make a vote on something is if it was a designated item of business, an agenda item. As Dan Tiernan said earlier, he's absolutely right. You can't start voting on things that were not designated as items of business for the meeting, because then people might say, it's a bait and switch. Well, how come you noticed the meeting for one thing, but then voted on something totally different? Last one from you, buddy. You're cut off. Go ahead, go ahead.
What if the president said, I don't want to come up with any agenda, and yet it was requested by a board?
I think you probably need a new president. Okay. Yes, I saw you up earlier. Yep.
Someone had mentioned to me, I was up at the pool house in a very small community, and I'm the only board member that lives in the community. So we were up at the pool house, I had a meeting, and we were talking about the community, and someone said I wasn't allowed to do that because I'm on the board. Is that correct?
You doing
I'm
it
also a homeowner.
by yourself? Yeah, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as you're not holding it out as some sort of official business of the association. It was just sort of, hey, I'm the president of the board, I'm on the board. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to talk about the community or educate or give information. Absolutely fine. Yes? There should be no vote. Those votes should not be counted. And if they're doing it, they should stop, because they can be the community can be sanctioned for that. If they're basically predetermining, okay, we're going to go to the meeting on agenda item 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Here's how we're all voting. That makes for not the type of open, productive meeting that Florida law wants to see. We're in the Sunshine State. We have the Sunshine Laws. They want everything to be out and open, and that they want to see your board's thought process. They want to see how you get to the point of voting yes or no, not just like, hey, let's vote on the plumbing contract. Okay, let's call for a motion. Let's call for a vote right away. They want to see that. Yes, in the back.
Can I just go back? The previous slide was solicitation of goods.
Okay.
I didn't see. Okay, so if the board knows that, let's say the president actually solicited something for his own property, and the homeowners would complain, but the board does not remove him, is it mandatory they remove him, or no?
No, look, this is something that if it's reported, it's a violation. The board probably has a fiduciary duty to the community if they're aware of this happening, to talk to that person, and it's certainly an opportunity to consult with the association's attorney. But it's something that, should not be allowed to go unchecked, because, then it snowballs, and once they feel like they can get away with that one time, certainly, future contracts and vendors, they're going to be trying to do the same thing. And the detriment is you might not be getting the right vendors for your community. You're getting the ones that are paying kickbacks. You're not getting the ones that are necessarily the best for your community. Yes?
Yeah, when you just said, the board finds that the office of the director violated the subsidy, the board shall, that means the board must immediately remove the director's charge.
Right, well, remember, you have to prove that they're doing it. So she's saying she heard. So,
if it's a fact, then there's no question about it. He or she must be removed.
yeah, oh yeah, no, if it's 100% fact, remember, when you hear that someone's getting a kickback, or they're getting some goods or services, there has to be, before you just kick them off the board, you want to make sure you're in good standing before you just do that. So you want to investigate that, and then you would go forward. Yes? Mr. Sklar.
Thank you. One thing I've noticed on our board is what you'll learn about the program. A lot of the people that live in the community, it's not a lack of willingness to vote or participate, it's a lack of communication. Do you know of any technologies that either send out a text message to every resident and email, something more efficient to streamline the process of voting?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's definitely ways with technology moving forward to get better participation. In the last few years, electronic voting has become an option. In fact, we just had a community. Is anyone here from Ponte Vecchio West? Okay, in Ponte Vecchio West. Your neighbor, Ponte Vecchio, had their election, and they did it with electronic voting. So, you know, it's few and far between. People have to opt into it. And the same with like text messages, email blasts. There are mechanisms, and I'm sure the management can maybe comment on this a little more. There are ways, there are companies that will do it, but the law is still a little draconian, a little behind the times. Your official notices still have to be sent in paper form, unless people, again, have opted in. They have to sign a piece of paper that says, I consent to get my notices by email. If they haven't signed that, you're going to mail it out to everyone, but that doesn't prevent your community, after doing that, from e-blasting, texting. Some communities, didn't you have a community channel in your neighborhood, a TV channel? Yeah, I'm seeing some heads nodding, you know, but sometimes a community channel will have information that people can go to. I will tell you that Florida condo law requires condos with more than 150 units to have a website now, with all the information posted, the notices of meeting right on the home page. That's unfortunately for condos, it's mandatory, but I'm sure a lot of HOAs have similar sites voluntarily. So there's a lot of ways that can be done. It's a matter of your community choosing to implement them. Yes?
The governing docs tend to prohibit things like electronic voting because they're specific about how notices have to be sent, things like that.
The statute says, you know, there's the statute on electronic voting says that, if the owners authorize it, that you don't need anything additional in your governing documents. You would want a board resolution to adopt it, and you need your owners to sign on to it. Of course, if your documents have language, your documents could have language that say, let's say it says the notice of meeting must be sent by either mail or hand delivery. Then you get into trouble because you have a must and only two options. But most documents say the notice will be given to the owners of the meeting at least 14 days in advance or something like that. And then you probably don't have any trouble, but again, it's something, you want to consult with the association attorney, make sure that if you want to go with electronic voting, that you don't have any stumbling blocks in your documents. Yes?
Going back to the email discussion.
Okay.
Project management. So how do you limit the board from moving a project along, you're meeting once a month, you need to make decisions, do we have these three options, these are all, what does everyone want to do?
Yeah, so...
Is that different than what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's different. Look, the day-to-day operation, we need to change a light bulb in the clubhouse. We need to give the contractor we already hired, needs the authorization to start work on, on this part of the property. That's part and parcel already of your initial vote to hire that particular contractor. Yep. All right, so your meeting notices, your notices which should contain an agenda. For an HOA, they do not have to for your regular meeting notices, but they should, so that you can properly limit the content of your meeting. But there should be an agenda for your meeting. The notice of the meeting has to be posted 48 hours in advance for a regular board meeting. Unless some other sort of notice is required by your documents. Almost every single one of them, though, is 48 hours for a regular board meeting. And most of the time in HOAs, there'll be like a sign at the entryway or something like that, maybe something at the clubhouse. This is alternate means of posting. I'm going to skip over this. You can read it. It talks about other ways, publication, broadcast. That's their uncommon ways of noticing meetings. going on for meeting notices here. So we talked about a 48-hour notice for a regular board meeting. If you're going to have a meeting for a special assessment or to change rules and regulations that concern the lot, let's say you want to pass a rule that we're going to change the hours of the pool at the clubhouse, that doesn't concern the lot, you can do that in a 48-hour notice. But if you say, we're going to tell people that they can't hang a clothesline in their front yard, that's something you would need to pass as a rule on a 14-day notice. So again, that or a special assessment that's being passed by the board, 14-day notice is required, again, in the same manner as your other notices would be sent. Let's see, on the notice of the special assessment, there's certain things that you want to specifically have in there. You want to have the nature of the assessments. It's also, the statute only says the nature of the assessments. The condo statute says you have to describe the nature, the purpose, and the cost. So nature and purpose are almost the same, but I would definitely include the cost because you can be sure that that's something that's going to be important to your owners to know. When you say, hey, we're going to renovate the clubhouse, there's a special assessment, when I get that notice, they're like, great, well, how much is it going to cost? How much is it going to cost per owner? And information, if possible, on repayment. Is it going to be all one lump sum? Is it going to be payable over 12 installments? What is it? You know, those are good things to put in the notice. Yes?
This requires either to do it by mail or hand posted.
Yes. Yes, you always, whenever, that's a good distinction. Whenever you're doing one of these 14-day notices, the statute, if it's a statutory notice like this, it's not just mail, you also have to post it on the property as well. So that's a good follow-up there. Members of the board who are not physically present for quorum can participate by speakerphone. Dan talked about that earlier, so I won't spend too much time on that. The majority of the quorum has the authority to act for the board, so if you have a 9-person board, your quorum number is 5. If you get 5 of you to show up, you can hold a board meeting. If 3 of the 5 vote to pass a measure that's proposed before the board, the measure passes. The only time it wouldn't is if you have a certain thing in your documents or by statute that requires a majority of the entire board. Then you would, of course, need 5 out of 9 to vote yes. But otherwise, it's going to be a majority of your quorum. And then the last item is just about consenting or concurring to the action. Let's see here. Board members, as we talked earlier, can't vote by proxy or secret ballot, except voting by secret ballot is permitted in the election of officers. We discussed that earlier. The thing we didn't discuss is voting by proxy. I had a board member say, I'm going to be on a cruise, I can't call into the meeting, but I'm going to give so-and-so my proxy, they're going to vote on this issue for me. And I told them, you can't do that. And they got mad at me. I said, look, don't shoot the messenger. You can't vote by proxy as a board member. So, either you can show up to the meeting if you're a board member, or you can call in, but you can't email and say, this is my vote. You can't, they said, well, what if we're able to get a text message off that's, they tell us by text, okay, we're at this point in the meeting, and now we're at this point in the meeting, and do you want to vote yes or no? I said, no, because again, the point of the open meeting and why speakerphones are allowed is everyone can hear it. So, that's why, again, a proxy can't vote. You can't do voting by other means or methods other than physical presence or by actually being on a speakerphone. Let's see, where are we? Do you want to do a break now? Let's do a break for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back, and you can ask your question when we come back. All right. Get started so we can get this done. We're going to shoot to be done by 12 o'clock. That's 45 minutes. So we're going to cut back a little bit on the questions. You can still ask them after we're done here. So we're going to move on. All right. So we're moving on to the board meetings. We're going to go to the middle portion there. The right of the owners to attend open meetings includes the right to speak at the meetings with regard to agenda items. So it's important if you do have agenda items, you have designated items of business that you allow your members to speak on it, and Dan Tierney commented on that earlier. As the last bullet point, owners have the right to tape record or videotape meetings. Some people say, well, I don't want to be recorded. Well, if you go to the meeting and someone wants to record it, they have the right. It's a place of public accommodation, and there is no inherent expectation of privacy there.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Okay, quickly, yes.
When they're doing the video recording, can they target other members, not the board, and just point the video camera at other members?
You're allowed to adopt rules regarding the recording process, so you can tell them that, that it needs to be a stationary device, it shouldn't be focused on, on members or anyone in particular, but traditionally, I think that probably the agencies that handle this stuff would say if someone wants to, for example, turn it to the person who's asking a question, that would be okay. But if they want to just turn around and, for example, video record you through the whole meeting, I would say, that's inappropriate. Okay? We've talked about the first bullet point. I had some questions come up about email. You can use it for communication. You should not be taking votes, though, via email. The second bullet point just talks about physical access for handicapped individuals. You have to make sure your meetings are accessible to people with disabilities. Let's see what else here. Trying to go through and see what we haven't hit. The second point is 20% of your owners can petition your board to address an item of business. So if you get a petition signed by 20% of your members, you have to put it on the next agenda meeting or hold a special meeting within 60 days. And keep in mind, all that means is you have to put it on the agenda. It doesn't mean to have a discussion. It doesn't mean you have to take a vote or make a motion. Remember, this is a board meeting. So if we had a community once where someone wanted to change the security, and they got a petition of people said, we want to change from the automated security, the electronic, where you call in, to we want an armed guard, and they got 20%, and the board held a meeting, and at the end of the meeting, those people who petitioned said, well, now we want to take a vote. And we said, this is a board meeting, not a membership meeting. The board hires and fires vendors, and the board has allowed you to have the discussion. We thank you for having the discussion, and that's it. And the statute actually says there's no obligation that you have to vote or take action on that item. It's just a discussion. That's all they get. Let's see. We talked about this, I believe, earlier. You have to give at least 3 minutes to speak on each agenda item. So if your owners have questions or comments, you have items of business you've designated, you want to make sure that your owners are given 3 minutes. And as Dan Tiernan said earlier, it's preferential to do that interspersed through the meeting. Because, a lot of my clients will, at the end, they'll have the owner comments. And like Dan said earlier, if you do that, well, if I'm an owner, what's the point of my comments or my questions when the matter's already been voted on? So it is beneficial and it is more effective to have it, as an item comes up, board discussion, allow for owner comment, then bring it back again to the board, call for a motion, and vote on it. Committees of the board. Committees are a group of people. They can be board members, they can be individual owners who are not board members, that are appointed to assist with certain actions for the board. A lot of times they're advisory in nature. There is one committee, the finding committee. That's a committee that board members cannot sit on. But otherwise, board members generally can participate in committees. Again, like officers, your committee members serve at your pleasure. So I one time had a finding committee and the board said, every time we're levying fines, the finding committee keeps overturning the fines. What do we do? And I said, get a new finding committee. They said, oh, we didn't know we could do that. We can get rid of these people. I said, you appointed them. You can get rid of them and appoint new people to the finding committee. So if you have a committee that's run amok, you can certainly get rid of one or more members at your pleasure as the board and reappoint or appoint other people. The same goes, I had a community once and this is an important slide here, you want to make sure you tell the committee specifically what their scope and powers are. We had a committee that was tasked with finding a lake maintenance company to maintain the lakes in their community and to interview and make recommendations. Well, guess what? They signed a contract. And the board said, what do you mean sign a contract? And they thought, oh, you asked us to go find a company. They said, we asked you to find some companies and make a recommendation, and then we would make a decision based on your recommendation. But they were not clear in how they tasked that committee, and that's why there was confusion. So you want to be clear with your committees. As far as your committee meetings that are held, some people say, well, are they open, are they not open? The only ones that by statute have to be open to the owners, where minutes are taken, are the two referenced here, where final decisions are made regarding expenditure of money, and when you're approving or disapproving architectural decisions. So all of you probably have an ARC, an architectural committee. How many of you have an architectural committee? Yeah, so almost everyone in an HOA. Those committee meetings are open, there should be minutes taken, and you should be posting notice of that committee meeting. The same with the first item. Your bylaws may dictate additional meetings that have to be open, but these two by statute must be open with minutes taken. Now we're getting to owner meetings. We talked about board meetings, we talked about committee meetings, there are owner meetings. They're called by the board generally for certain purposes, your annual meeting, if you want to pass an amendment, waiving or reducing reserves, things like that. Generally, unless your bylaws dictate otherwise, in HOAs they can, but generally it's a 14-day notice, both mailed and posted. But your bylaws, some communities say 15 days, and then some of them say, for example, Ponte Vecchio West, we had their documents say when we did the mailing for their amendment, it was not sooner than I think 14 or 15, but they also couldn't do it more than 60 days in advance. So we had to make sure we were within that window because we didn't want to do it prematurely either. So, just again, important distinctions for you to be aware of. Quorum, we talked about this, I think, a lot earlier. You need quorum to have a meeting. Most communities, 30% for your HOA, unless your documents have a lower percentage. So if your bylaws say you only need 10% to have a quorum, you're 10%. If your bylaws say you need 50%, you default to the statute, 30. Yes? Her question is, do the people who are having their applications being reviewed need to individually be noticed to the meeting? They probably should be given notice that their application is being considered at the meeting in case they want to be there to inform on it and help out with the decision. But there's no requirement. I can tell you, my community, my wife and we did some changes to our house a few years ago, and there was, we didn't attend the meeting. We just kind of use the application, let us know when it's approved or denied, okay? You do have to post the meeting, though, that the meeting is happening, so anyone who wants to attend and witness it can be there, okay? This slide is about proxies. It just states that now, years ago, you had to actually collect the original ink signed document. Now with proxies, you're allowed to collect them electronically, meaning people can take a photo of it and text it in. They can email it in as an attachment. Now they can't write in the email, I name as my proxy so-and-so, but they can take the form and make it a PDF, type of attachment. So that was beneficial. Owner inquiries. In a condo association, if an owner asks a question by certified mail, you have to respond to them within 30 days, with some other nuances, but generally 30 days you have to respond to a request. In an HOA, if someone writes, I want an answer, I demand answers, I want to know this, that, and the other, you have no obligation to respond to them by statute. So just something to be mindful of, whereas a condo association does. Official records. These are important. We talked earlier, traditionally the secretary keeps the records, but of course your management company is going to be doing that for you. They're supposed to be kept for up to 7 years. They have to be made available within 45 miles of the community or within the county limits. You have to maintain an adequate number of copies of certain documents. You can adopt reasonable rules regarding frequency, time, location, etc. of your owners inspecting the documents. And sometimes you really need to do that. Where we find we have to do that is where people are using the document inspection almost as like a means of harassing the board or the community. We have people that we had a guy that literally every week was like, I want to see all the documents. And the statute and case law says you can't ask them for a reason why. You can't restrict them from looking at documents. You can't restrict them from saying they want to see all of them. You can't say, well, narrow it down. If they say, I want to see all the official records, you have to make them all available to them. You have to do it within 10 days, 10 business days of their request. Yes?
Yeah, but you can limit the time and place that they can view the documents.
Correct.
They don't have to have them individually, they can't take them out of the office.
Right.
And you can charge them. I'm asking.
Yes, all of that is accurate. So you absolutely, as it says here, you know, we've talked about frequency, time, location. So we have one guy, they have a clubhouse on site. He was, you know, doing this as a means of just being a jerk because he was spiteful against the manager and the board. And what they did was they took up office space. This is in Palm Beach County. They, I think in, you know, Jupiter or something. They paid $100. They moved all the records up to this office space. It was just a storage room. It was like an executive office. They just put the records in there. And the next time you asked, they passed rules that said official records inspections are going to be at that location. And now we said, well, it's within the county limits, so go drive up to Jupiter if you want to go inspect the records. And guess what? You stop inspecting the records. So sometimes you need to be clever with that when you have people who are using it as a means of harassment. But you do not want to withhold them unreasonably. You want to err on the side of disclosing and giving the records when they're requested, because I can tell you the DBPR does handle these disputes for HOAs, and they are very favorable towards the owners, not the associations, favorable towards disclosure and not retention. So you want to make sure you are, you know, not unreasonably withholding documents. As the gentleman said, you can charge fees, you can charge a rate for the time spent retrieving and copying the records. If it exceeds a half an hour at a time, and you can charge a per copy cost. And those, I was talking about the time you can charge up to $20 an hour. In the statute, by statute, you can charge up to 25 cents per page for copies. Yep. It doesn't have to be. A homeowner can come in and they can. No, they don't have to be kept as paper. You can make the documents accessible electronically, meaning if someone wants to come in and inspect the records, you can say, here's the computer, here's the records, there you go. You can make them accessible by internet. If you have a means, if you have a website or something, a lot of times the manager will say, oh, the records you've requested are on the website. We'll direct you to the website. So there are other means of providing the records, and also, the owners, you can also make sure that your owners are not demanding copies. You want to make sure that your owners are not demanding copies. They can't demand that you give them copies. So a lot of times, well, the owners say, I want this, this, and this sent to me by, tomorrow or next week or something. The law says that is not an official records request. The official records they're allowed to make is to inspect the documents at a time and place determined by the association. It is not that they can demand you give them copies. So again, if you have people who are being difficult and are saying they want copies, you can indulge them and say, okay, if it's easy enough, here you go. But under the applicable case law, those are not treated as official records requests, those demands. One more question on this, we're going to move on. Yes?
Where can I find information on what is an official document and what is, for example, a purchasing record?
You want to go to the statute. The statute actually lists out in 720. There's a section on official records that lists like sections letter A through X or something of all the things that are official records. But I will tell you the last section of that says, and any other written documents that are used in the operation of the community. So if you have like a purchase order, that's absolutely going to fall under that. That's an official record. Okay? For time purposes, we're going to move on. Okay? We talked about most all of this. Electronic copying. If an owner wants to use their cell phone, a scanner, a portable scanner, or something like that, they're absolutely allowed to use that in lieu of making copies. So when they show up for the inspection, they can use whatever device they like to electronically capture images of the documents. One point I would make, if you are having people review your records, I strongly suggest you have a representative of the association, like a management company representative or a board member, basically babysit that person, because you don't want records to disappear, especially crucial records, because these are your originals, they could be, and you don't want them to walk out the door or be defaced or altered. You want someone in there to make sure that you're assisting with that, or that they're not, I'm sorry, that you're assisting and they're not doing anything that they shouldn't be doing. There are certain records that are inaccessible, so these are still your records of your community. You have them in your possession, but if an owner wants to look at them, they are not allowed to look at them. And as you can imagine, the things, attorney-client documents, anything in connection with an approval of a lease, so we're talking about maybe like a background check. There's actually one case that says the lease itself should not be disclosed. Personnel records, anyone that works for the community, medical records, identification, social security numbers that you might have on file. For example, 55 and over communities, they have to do a survey every 2 years of the community to verify that a certain percentage of people living there are over 55 years old. How do they do that? Well, they have to collect, in addition to the survey, they have to collect proof from those people that they're over 55, which is a driver's license, a social security card, something like that. So those are things if a homeowner said, I want to see all the licenses you collected in connection with the survey, they can see the surveys, they can't see the licenses. And then some of these other items here. We talked about the 10 working days to respond. Let's see here. If you don't give them the opportunity to inspect the records that they are entitled to inspect within the 10 working days, there's a presumption that you violated the statute, and they can get damages up to $50 a day, so $500 of statutory damages. Seeing what else we haven't touched on. This is just some information about a phone directory. You can read at your leisure. Estoppels. I'm just going to tell you quickly, estoppel letters are when you buy a property or someone's selling a property, they produce an estoppel letter. This is something, there was some legislation a few years ago. These are handled by me as your attorney and by your management company. So it's something, again, you can read through. It's basically just a letter that summarizes what someone owes, as well as having some additional information in it about the property. And it's used in connection with the sale of a property. And it basically, it's an estoppel. It means, it's a technical legal word, it means you are stopped from asking for something outside of it. So if we send an estoppel letter, my firm, that says so-and-so owes $5,000, that's the debt on the unit before they sell the home, that needs to be paid out at closing. If it turns out they owe $6,000, the association would be prevented from then later going back and saying you owe another $1,000. That's the purpose of the certificate, is it's something they rely on. Yes, one quick question.
The service dog papers apply to the official records? Are they available or not?
No, medical records, because if those are going to be medical records from a doctor, those should not be provided to owners asking for them. Bids and contracting, all you familiar with competitive bidding, that you have to get bids, right? So, well, sometimes that's misconstrued to mean, anything and everything we want to do, we need to get bids. No, if it's 10% of your total budget, including reserves, whatever your budget is, if your budget for operating is $1 million, and you have, and then your budget for reserve is $200,000, that's $1.2 million for your budget. So any project that's going to cost over $120,000 would need to be competitively bid, with there are certain exceptions, as you'll see in the second bullet point. For example, attorneys, accountants, architects, community association managers, engineering, landscape architects. That's not a landscaper who cuts your grass. That's a landscape architect who designs your community landscaping. Those are all contracts that do not need to be competitively bid, even if they're going to exceed 10% of your budget. And remember, under competitive bidding, there's no obligation. You don't have to accept the lowest bid. You just have to accept the bid that you feel as a board is best for your community. So again, no obligation to accept the lowest bid. But you want to use, obviously, good, reasonable business judgment. And sometimes I will say, we've had communities that did a siding project. Their quotes were like 1.8 million, 1.7, and then one guy came in at 1.1, and I told them, the 1.1 is a company I never heard of, a small company. I think they underbid it, and sure enough, the guy ended up walking away with their deposit, and he ended up being arrested in Virginia for all sorts of financial crimes. So, but they lost out, and I told them, the cheapest is, you get what you pay for, right? So, anyway, just something to be mindful of, to use your discretion when going through the bids. So some other bullet points here, I'll touch on some of them. Of course, if there's an emergency, like let's say after a hurricane, and there's limited supply of something, limited contractors, then your competitive bidding, you can suspend the competitive bidding requirements. For time's sake, I'm sorry, I'm just moving through it a little quicker. Conflict of interest contracts, we talked about this earlier. This is sort of a simplistic version of how, if you wanted to contract with your own association, what you would have to do. There are disclosures in 617-0832, which you have to look at. You want to get 2/3 of your directors to agree to it. You have to disclose all of it at a meeting. And if it's canceled by the owners, the association is only liable for the goods and services provided as of the termination date, not for anything else that might have been due or come due in the future under a contract. But again, I will tell you, if you're a board member, it is not worth it. Do not contract with your association. As far as budgeting, of course, the association maintains the common property and the community, so how do you pay for it? Well, budgeting. An operating association is just like running any other business. You're an entity, you're an INC, right? So you have to plan your revenues and come up with a budget every year against your expenditures to know what we will need. And usually your prior year is going to be a pretty good indicator, but you need to be mindful. Sometimes they're not. From like 06 to 07 or 07 to 08, the prior year was not really a great indicator of the next year or the following year, because as we all know, we had a big recession. So, for example, maybe the legal bills in 06 were low, and then in 08 and 09 were high because you had a lot of delinquencies. And again, bad debt, low in 05 and 06, skyrocket in really, let's call it 08, 09. So, again, you want to be mindful that you're not just rubber stamping a prior year, just carrying it over with like a 2% increase. You want to, put some of your real world considerations in addition to projects and things like that come up. So we talked earlier, the treasurer is usually involved in this process, and usually a lot of the board members are. You want to have a plan for it. Having a budget certainly assists you during the year as well to stick to your spending. As I just mentioned, you have an operating, and you may have a reserve. We'll get to that in a second. Operating, these are all the sorts of things you have in operating. Who knows what generally is the most expensive cost any community has in their operating? Anyone? Who said insurance? Insurance. Your insurance for most communities is going to be your number one most expensive cost that you have for your community. And I'm talking about collectively, all your insurance policies. As far as other items, you're going to have, everything else is really second to that. Depending on how big your community is, I'm sure this community, their landscaping budget, I'm sure is substantial. If you live in a large community, you're going to have a substantial landscaping budget. And then other things are, they're less, they're certainly less, like, you got postage and things like that. But there's just some examples of your budgeting. Reserves in an HOA. Condos have to have reserves, okay? Mandatory by statute. But HOAs only if the documents require them, they were set up by the developer initially, or the owners subsequently voted affirmatively to have them, do you have what's called statutory reserves. So I have some communities that say, well, we don't have any of that, but we still collect reserves. What are those? Those are what we call non-statutory reserves. They're like a contingency fund, and there really is not the same level of control or earmarking for those funds as there are for actual statutory reserves. So those funds are more freely used. Yes?
We're not required to have reserves in the HOA, you can elect it if that's or not. But are we required to have a future plan that goes down the road for several years?
If you have no reserves, then there's no point, doing like a reserve study or something like that. If you don't have reserves and you're not collecting reserves, then you can still have a reserve study to have an idea of when expenses are going to come due. Like let's say the roof of the clubhouse, when that's going to need to come due. But because you're not reserving for it, that's just going to really give you an idea of when you're going to have to specially assess for that. So look, reserves are the typical, do I want to pay now or do I want to pay later? You know, people always say, well, I don't want reserves. In condos, they can vote to waive them. They're supposed to have them. They can vote to waive them. Well, guess what? If they waive them, they're setting themselves up for a big expense later on. So like I said, it's pay an extra $50 a month now, or in 5 years get hit with a $5,000 assessment or something like that. Okay? There's no requirement to have a reserve study or a plan done. Even if you have mandatory reserves, you do not have to have a reserve study done by statute, but it's advisable that you do it anyway, because that way you'll know how to properly budget your reserves. Yes, I'm going to move on just for sake of timing here. The budgeting, this is just about the notice requirements. The notice requirement, is generally a 14 days where we recommend. It could be different based on your individual documents. Again, that's something for you to check. Usually it's the board that adopts the budget. Once in a while you have a funky bylaws that require a membership vote to approve of any budget, not just a budget maybe where there's a big increase, but any budget. And unfortunately, that can be cumbersome. So that's something to check your documents, but generally speaking, it's the board adopts the budget. And as I said, there's, you want to check for your notice requirements. The frequency of assessments, how many of you are monthly? Okay, so a couple. How many of you are quarterly? More so, and how about a yearly? Anyone? Okay. In HOAs, you tend to get more quarterly type of assessments. I have some clients that are yearly, but yeah, quarterly is pretty common. And look, it's again, whatever you've established in conjunction with your governing documents, is once you've established the budget, that's how often you're going to be collecting the funds. Owner delinquency. If an owner is delinquent more than 90 days in a monetary obligation, you can suspend their voting and or their amenity access rights. So, one of the questions we commonly get, well, okay, we want to suspend their clubhouse, their pool. Great, you can do that. You have to do it at a meeting. You have to vote at a meeting to do it. It's not just, you can't just do it by a letter. You have to vote at a meeting to do that. But then we get questions that gets a little more tricky is, what about if we want to suspend their gate access, meaning they can't go through the resident gate, they have to go through the guest gate. And that can get a little sticky, but I think the way the statute's changed justifies that you could reasonably do that. There's some cases that said you couldn't turn off the gates, but those were before the statute changed. And the wording of the statute changed, and that's something I think is viable and it's effective, because certainly, when homeowners are used to breezing through the gates, they don't want to wait in line. So it's been effective, but I say use that with caution and consult your attorney if you want to turn off gate access. But there are certain things you can't get rid of. Like, you can't get rid of their entire gate access. You still have to let them through the visitor gate. You can't take away parking rights. You can't take away utilities. If, like, some communities, they control the water for the entire community and bill it as part of the assessment. They can't obviously turn off the water to someone's home if they're delinquent. And look, in all honesty, taking away amenity access sometimes is really not that effective, because let's say you say someone can't come to the clubhouse, and even if you have a fob system and you turn off their fob, a friend lets them in. Who's policing it? So that's a tough thing to take care of. Yes?
Suspend access to inspect documents?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely cannot do that. Then we go to liens and collection. So look, in addition to those other remedies, this is where, really I come in. If someone hasn't paid and your management company sent them notices and they still haven't paid, you turn them over to the lawyer, and, we send them statutory notices. And there's certain, there's information there you can review. I won't bore you with the lawyer stuff here. This is really all this is for. As far as if you have homes that are delinquent, that have tenants in them, we can send, we'll call it like a rent interception letter, where we can demand that the tenant turn over the rent to us. And if they don't, up until such time as the debt is paid, of course. But if they don't, what's the remedy? Well, you can evict the tenant, which, look, if the tenant's not causing much problem, most of my clients, they say, well, we're not going to spend the money to evict them. It was just, the value of the tenant rent demand letter is really in the threat of eviction, because the owner gets it, the tenant gets it, and of course, as you can imagine, the tenants call the owner, what's going on, I don't want to get evicted, and we get a good response from those letters. And that's a good tool that we have. Let's see now, we're moving in, yes. Well, your documents may allow you to do the maintenance on the property, to enter the lot and do the work, the corrective work, and to bill back the owner's account. That's dependent on if your documents say that or not. So for cleanup purposes, that's what you should do. But the number one thing you should do is foreclose and get that person out of there. Absolutely, I do it every day. I'm sorry I have to, but it's part of the job. Look, we foreclose on homes all the time. If people aren't paying their dues and their fair share, we file liens, and if they don't pay those liens, we file foreclosures. Now look, if there's a bank that has a loan on a property and they're foreclosing too, they're a higher priority. But we push, at least in my office, we push them as hard and as fast as we can to beat the bank to the punch, to try to get it sold. Because an example like yours, you want to just get a new owner in there. Because I can tell you the quickest way of getting that property cleaned up is getting it transferred, the ownership, to someone new, because they're either going to want to live there, or they're going to want to flip it and sell it or rent it, and looking the way it's looking, they're not going to be able to do any of that. So the best and most effective way is to just get it foreclosed on, either whether the bank does it or you do it. And these are things we do for our clients every day. We evaluate the situation and we'll recommend, let's push the bank, let's make the bank foreclose quicker. Or hey, the bank's not doing anything, or there is no bank, there's no mortgage, let's go all the way with a foreclosure and get it sold. You end up getting all your money back and you get a new owner, okay? We're going to go to financials. Yes, one more, quick. That's one that's controversial right now. There are some practitioners that actually sue associations and advertise that they sue associations for turning off cable TV and internet, because they are arguing that in this day and age, especially internet, is a utility. And there's at least one arbitrator that has agreed with that theory, that you should not be turning off cable and internet. Now, some of your providers allow you a mechanism to do that. I don't necessarily agree that those are utilities. I think utilities are water, sewer, gas, electricity, the traditional utilities. Those are what you can reasonably turn off. What I've counseled clients is you can do it, but there is a little bit of a risk with it. I'm sorry, I'm going to move on to the next slide. If you have other questions, please come up to me afterwards. Financial statements, these are, again, this is the last slide. A few slides were lawyer slides. These are CPA slides. I'm going to move through this because most of you do an audit. If you have more than 500,000 in revenue, you do an audit. Actually, some communities that are less than 500 still have it audited. You should do an audit every year. You're required to do an audit every year of your financials. You all, I'm sure, have CPAs engaged to do that. And they'll audit your prior year and produce that statement for you. I'm not going to go through all the details of this, because it's not really so relevant to your day-to-day operations as board members. As I said, you see the hierarchy here. These are the types of statements that you have, the requirements based on, those are the statutory amounts. Again, most communities are doing audits, but there are some lower levels. You can vote to reduce the financial reporting. So I gave you those tiers. You can vote to go from one tier to the immediate lower reporting standard, but most communities, I don't know, in fact, I don't know of any of them. None of my clients have ever done it. Most of them do the audit. You are a corporation. You do have a federal income tax return. Again, I'm sure that's something your CPA handles. You are a not-for-profit company, but you're not a tax-exempt corporation like a charity. Like a 501c3, I think is what it is. Those, you're not one of those. You're not a profit company, but should file a tax return. And again, you would determine with your accountant the best way of filing your return. You also do have to file an annual corporate report. That's, I mentioned Sunbiz earlier. That's the website for your Florida Department of State. Every corporation every year has to file a statement or a report indicating who the directors are, who are the members of the company, who's the registered agent, what is its mailing address, what is its physical address, and the name. And that's really it. It's pretty simple. It's really, a way for the state to collect some money, and for, for people if they want to know. For example, I'm the registered agent for many of our clients. And why is that important? Because when a bank files a lawsuit, and as many of you know, they have to name the association in the lawsuit, so you're aware of it because you have an interest. So when they say, hey, we need to sue John Smith for foreclosure, and we have to name X and YZ association, they say, well, who do we serve the lawsuit on? They go to the sunbiz.org site, and they'll see, oh, Dan Wasserstein is the registered agent. That's who we serve process on. And that's the importance of that element of it. But then again, like I said, if someone needs to contact their community, that's an important thing that you have that information that's accurate. Material alterations and amendments, these are important issues. Any of you that's run into them know that they probably take up more than 1 or 2 slides on a presentation. I just wanted to briefly touch on them. Material alteration, you're not supposed to materially alter your common areas, meaning you have a tennis court and let's bulldoze it for a parking lot. Or we have a jacuzzi that no one ever uses, let's just fill it over with cement and tile over it. Those are alterations. Let's change the color of the building. Alteration, even the slightest shade is considered an alteration. You need to check your documents and see, does the board have the authority to do that, or do the members have to partake in that? And many documents will say the members have to partake. Or they'll say something like, if any material alterations in the course of a calendar year exceed $50,000, that they have to be voted on by the membership. So again, it's something you want to be mindful of and be careful of when you are making changes. Certainly if you're going to repaint the clubhouse the same color, that's regular maintenance, you don't need a vote. If you're going to, you have a tennis court that's a little run down and you're just going to repaint the lines and put up a new net and a fence, again, no vote needed. But you want to convert the tennis court into a basketball court or some other use, you have to check your docs, make sure what vote you need to do that. And then the other item, amending your documents, you again want to check your documents to see what sort of voting threshold do we need from our membership to do that. Is it 2/3 of our members? Is it a simple majority? What do we need to change our governing documents when we want to make changes to them? And if they're silent, then it's by default, the statute makes it 2/3. So if your documents don't dictate how your amendments are made, again, 2/3 of all your owners is what's required as an approval vote for anything you're proposing. Violations and fining, another important issue, when people are doing things they're not supposed to do. The way it's supposed to work under the statute since 2000, I think it changed in 2016, is that now there used to be something you could just use a fining committee, and it was a little more simple, and they kind of had all the authority to determine the fine and levy the fine, and they could decide all the factors about it. Now the way it's supposed to work is you get word of a violation. Usually your management company's going to handle this. They're going to find out about it. They're going to look at it. They're going to see if there's merit. If there's merit, they're going to send the owner a notice of the violation and tell them, look, you have X amount of days to correct this situation. If it's something that's not, like, look, for example, if someone had a party till 3 a.m. Saturday night, there's nothing to correct. It's over. You go right almost to the fining process there. But let's say they haven't painted their house or their driveway or their landscaping is awful. You'll usually send them a notice. You have 15 days, you have 30 days to correct this, or fines may be levied against you. Again, you don't need to give that warning letter, but I recommend that give them a chance to correct it. And then the next step is the board holds a meeting. Fining is an agenda item, and whoever they intend to fine, following their documents, whatever their documents dictate. Some documents from some of my clients say they can only fine a max of $50 for a particular fine. Okay, the statute says 100, but if their documents say 50, they have to go with that, because the statute says it can be anything up to 100, not that it has to be 100. So if your documents have a lesser amount, you use a lesser amount. The board levies the fine. So, and that happens at a meeting. So the board holds a meeting, levies the fine, and then you send out notice to the owner and say, a fine's been levied by the board, but before it's going to be imposed, this is your notice of the fining committee's meeting, and they're going to meet to give a final review. All the committee can do is yes or no. We had one this week, a client asked me, the committee said they're going to give them 30 days to fix it. And then if they don't, they'll fine them. I said the committee can't do that anymore. All they can do by statute is yes or no to whatever the board's decided. So if the board levied a fine of $100, the committee can't say, well, we'll do it at 50. If the board said it's due now, they can't say we'll give them 30 days. But if the board said we'll levy the fine, but it won't go into effect for 30 days, and only if they don't correct it, then the committee can say, okay, we approve what the board did and not go into effect. But again, they're just a yes or no, no editorializing. Okay? And, the max fine is $1,000, but in an HOA, if your documents authorize it, it can be more than $1,000. And if it's $1,000 or more, and your documents authorize that fines can be collected like liens, then you can also lien for it if it's $1,000 or more. That doesn't mean if you have 5 $200 violations that you can group them together to make $1,000. But if it's one violation that was $100 a day and it hit the 10-day mark of not being fixed and you have $1,000, then if your documents say that those fines can be collected like liens, because you've hit the $1,000 for one violation, you arguably can go ahead and lien. Yes, I'll take one quick question on this. Absolutely, you cannot fine without a fining committee, and importantly, the fining committee has to be comprised of people who are not board members, nor people who live with or related to board members, or their employees. So you have to be independent owners that comprise the committee. It has to be at least 3 people, and you have to have that committee to fine. Now, I have some communities that, look, they can't get a fining committee. People don't want to do it, they don't have participation. So they say, well, what do we do? Can we send a letter that says, we're going to fine you? Well, you can send a letter, and what I recommend is say, if you do not correct this deficiency, the board may levy fines against you. Because there's nothing wrong with saying you may levy them, and even though you don't have a committee, there's nothing wrong with saying, because you could always form a committee, on a 48-hour notice. So, that's something you can add to your letters, but you couldn't follow through with that threat unless you actually had a fining committee. Yes, one more question. Yeah, you would need to do what's called a reinforcement process, and that's something you really need to talk to the association attorney or me about, on how you go about basically reinvigorating your covenants that haven't been enforced strictly. There's a process for it. It's pretty simple, but there's a process for that. We're almost done here, coming in on time. Service and emotional support animals, everyone's favorite thing, right? Okay, so-and-so, we don't allow dogs, no dogs. Okay, guess what? Here's a note from my doctor. I'm bringing my Doberman in. I'm bringing my pit bull in. Well, guess what? If they get a note that is sufficient from a treating professional, or actually now, the law is so favorable towards people with these dogs that OEO, Office of Equal Opportunity in Palm Beach, we sent the lady a letter that said we need a letter from your treating professional. Because the law says it doesn't have to be a doctor. It could be a social worker, psychiatrist, whatever, psychologist, whatever. We said we need a letter from your treating professional. And now they're saying, well, we think that might be discriminatory because all the statute says is we can ask for reliable documentation, and these people at the OEO who are making the determination of discrimination are saying, well, it might be discriminatory because maybe their neighbor can produce a statement, an affidavit that says they need the dog. And I said, are you kidding me? Really? And that's, look, and so what I tell you now, if you have someone that's made service and emotional support animals, the law is right now, you lose and they win. And that's some being blunt with you. We have an association, as of 3 months ago, settled a federal dog, emotional support dog case. It was before they were overly aggressive with denying it, but they settled the case for $100,000, no insurance. Okay? So they have a special assessment, and people are not happy about it over a denial of an emotional support dog. Yes? Absolutely. The law says that the emotional support animal must be allowed to accompany the owner anywhere that they would otherwise be allowed to go. The only place the dog cannot be is in the actual swimming pool per the Florida Department of Health. They can be at the pool deck, they can be in the clubhouse, anywhere the owner can go other than the swimming pool, that dog can go with them. Yes?
Quick question to go back.
Okay?
Did you specifically state that the Florida statute says that the spouse of a board member cannot serve on a fine committee?
Yes. Yes. There are no limitations on what animals can be support animals. They've approved potbelly pigs, miniature horses, and I think Minnesota, a capuchin monkey, turtles. You've seen all this stuff on the news, emotional support squirrels. There's a lady in Florida who was on the news 2 months ago suing her association because she has 3 emotional support chickens. And then she's suing her HOA for that. And this is the kind of stuff, we laugh at it, but these agencies, I am telling you, if I were their lawyer, I'd say, you're going to lose. This lady's going to be able to have her emotional support chickens, because that's just the way the law is right now, no matter how ridiculous it is. You know, we had one lady that asked for 3 support animals. We said, please provide us with documentation as to what each one does differently that the other one can't do to justify why it's reasonable that we accommodate your request for not 1 but 3. Went to the local agency said, well, we don't think she should have to produce. I said, are you kidding me, really? So the law and this stuff, they win, we lose. I'm sorry, I'm going to just go through here just to finish. This is just another slide that we've already been discussing. This is the final slide. If anyone has questions, you can ask me after. These are just some changes from like a year ago. Just want to be mindful that the statute was updated. You should be sending your member notices to the mailing address listed with the property appraiser when you're doing your mailings. It's kind of created some issues because every time you do your mailing, if you have 500 homes, you have to verify with the property appraiser that you have the right mailing address. I mean, it's kind of a ridiculous requirement because traditionally it's like whatever the owner has told you is their address, that's what you use. So this is a little ridiculous. My fellow practitioners and I think that'll be taken back or removed. And then the second one, amendments to rules and regulations have to be recorded in the public records now. The statute says, it was changed 2 years ago to say governing documents are defined to include declaration, bylaws, articles, and they added rules and regulations. And then this year, past year, or 2 years ago, I think unintentionally, they put into the statute on amendments that amendments of all governing documents have to be recorded. And I don't think they were remembering that 2 years prior they added rules and regulations. So traditionally, rules and regulations have never been recorded. They still don't have to be recorded for a condo, but now if you're amending your rules and regulations, they should be recorded. And I think we have some clients in here who actually had to go through that. So that's the end of the presentation. You all have your certificates. All you have to do is fill it out. Thank you. And if you are looking for a new attorney, I know someone.
Thank you very much, Dan. Appreciate that. Hopefully you all learned something today. It was entertaining. The only thing I would encourage you as board members, it is tough out there. You volunteers, you put yourself on the line. If you need help, talk to an attorney, talk to your manager, get some help. Because there's no, so often I see somebody, we can save a little here, save a little there. They end up on a hot plate for $500. So get some help. Last thing, everybody got their certificate? Okay, if not, see me. And then please fill out your survey, give us some honest feedback, what you like, what you didn't like, and if there's anything you'd like to see in the future, please. And drop that with Ashley on your way out the back door. We are going to have a drawing and you will be notified. Yes, thank you. Yes, yes. Thank you.